Spanish Texas. The Texas shoreline was first viewed by a Spaniard on an unknown date in 1519. This began about 3 centuries of Spanish claim to possess Texas that lasted until July 21, 1821, when the flag of Castile and Leon was lowered for the last time at San Antonio. The uninterrupted Spanish occupation of Texas lasted for only 105 years, because for the first 200 years or so of Spain's claim to Texas, it did very little to actually settle the area. There are lots of legacies or reminders of Spanish Texas around us. One is the use of Spanish names for hundreds of towns, cities, counties, and rivers and creeks in Texas. San Antonio, for example, which was founded by the Spanish and which was the first formal municipality in Texas, is one of the 10 largest cities in the United States today. 42 of the 254 counties in Texas bear either Hispanic names or an anglicized derivation, such as Galveston, or a misspelling, such as Uvalde. Llano Estacado, the Guadalupe Mountains, and Padre Island were named by Spanish explorers and conquistadors who crossed portions of Texas well before the English settled the Atlantic coast of North America. Spaniards brought numerous European crops to the area, implemented irrigation at San Antonio and other mission sites, and gave birth to ranching by introducing their various livestock handling techniques, and related ranching terminology. Farming, initially practiced by some Indian groups in Texas, was expanded by Spanish missionaries and settlers. Spanish livestock and agriculture had a lasting environmental impact by altering the landscape over time. Three areas of Spanish law left a lasting legacy in Texas: certain procedural rules affecting trials, the law affecting land titles and certain water rights, and a large body of rules affecting family relationships. Anglo-American colonists of Texas found in the Spanish legal system a number of elements better adapted to their conditions than Anglo-American legal institutions from the United States. Anglo-American judicial procedure was inordinately complex and operated through 2 different sets of courts with different rules, those of law and equity. The Castilian legal system had a unitary judiciary, and Castilian court rules of pleading were simple and straightforward, as compared to the complicated English forms of action and pleadings. And so these Spanish rules were also retained. The Castilian principle of venue of lawsuits was also favored, whereas the English rule was that a person was sued in the court of the locality where the facts giving rise to the dispute occurred. The Spanish rule required that a person be sued where he lived for the convenience of the defendant. The Castilian tradition also provided a model for a system of probate administration that was much simpler than the English system. The Texas institution of an independent executor, seemingly modeled on the Castilian Albacea Universal, provides for great flexibility and reduced cost in probate practice. Texas law allows a person to designate an independent executor in the will to serve without bond. An independent executor can sell property to settle claims against the estate and distribute property to the will's beneficiaries with minimal supervision by the court. This is called an independent administration, which is considerably less costly and substantially quicker than the dependent administration. Adoption was unknown in English common law. Its comparatively early institution by statute in Texas in 1850 is generally attributed to the Spanish legal tradition. The law of matrimonial property is also heavily influenced by the Spanish tradition. Anglo-Americans liked the Spanish idea of common ownership of the gains of marriage between husband and wife, the system known as community property. Protection of certain land and tools of husbandry and trade from creditors' claims was also appealing to the Anglo settlers, as opposed to the creditor-oriented rule of English common law. Women, even the poor and uneducated, enjoyed more privileges under Castilian law than did their English and Anglo-American counterparts. They not only could own property in their own name, but also had equal ownership of any wealth and property acquired after marriage. They were held responsible for any debts incurred during the marital union. The husband could not sell any of their joint holdings without her explicit written permission. Legitimate daughters could inherit equally with legitimate sons, and a widow could manage and sell inherited assets at her own discretion. As the frontier of New Spain advanced, the missionary work in Coahuila, Nuevo León, New Mexico, and Texas became the primary responsibility of the Franciscan order. Zealously working to bring Christianity to the peoples of Texas, the Franciscans tried to make Indians productive subjects of the Spanish crown and assist the state in expanding its claims to the northern frontier. From 1682 to 1793, the Franciscan friars established almost 40 different missions of varying longevity. In 1519, the Spanish governor of Jamaica outfitted Alonso Alvarez de Pineda with 4 ships and 270 men. Searching for wealth, Pineda sailed the northern Gulf waters from the Florida Keys to Veracruz. He constructed the first map of the region and gave the name Rio del Espíritu Santo, River of the Holy Spirit, to the Mississippi River. Pánfilo de Narváez left Spain in June 1527 and landed near Tampa Bay with some 400 men in the spring of 1527 after spending the winter in Cuba. 300 of the men, along with their leader, were soon separated from their support vessels and stranded on the Florida coast. In improvised barges, roughly 250 survivors in September set out from northwestern Florida for Mexico. The small flotilla passed the mouth of the Mississippi River, and short of the Texas coast it was caught in a violent storm. 2 of the craft landed near the western extremity of Galveston Island in early November. Of the men who had left Florida, only 4, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Andrés Dorantes de Carranza, his African-born slave Estevanico, and Alonso Castillo Maldonado, only those 4 survived. They lived for 7 years amid various Indians and the harsh environment of the Texas coast. Only after an incredible odyssey did they reach Mexico City in the summer of 1536. The accounts of these 4 men in the later writing of Cabeza de Vaca provided the first descriptions of Texas landforms, Indians, and biology. He was the only Spaniard to record the names of the first peoples of South Texas and to locate them relative to each other. The experiences of the 4 ragged castaways spurred interest in possible wealth to the north, particularly the rumored 7 cities of Cibola. This prompted Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza of New Spain to request and receive a royal license to sponsor the first organized European-led penetration of what is today northwestern Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado was the leader of an ambitious 2,000-member expedition to explore the lands to the north. The undertaking, which lasted from 1539 to 1542 and covered thousands of miles, produced hardship, frustration, and disappointment, rather than fame and fortune. From a base on the Rio Grande, north of present-day Albuquerque, Coronado reached the panhandle of West Texas in the spring of 1541. His army crossed the Llano Estacado, discovered Palo Duro Canyon, and encountered the Plains Indians of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The Hernando de Soto expedition is shown on this map. It began in Florida around 1540 and ended around 1542. The expedition captured Indians for slave labor and preyed upon native women, eventually leading to constant non-stop wars or battles between the Spaniards and the Indians that they encountered. Hernando de Soto, the leader of the expedition, died during the exploration. His second in command, Luis de Moscoso Alvarado, then assumed command. Moscoso entered the future state of Texas in the summer of 1542 and reached what may have been the Trinity River, or perhaps the Brazos in central Texas. An Indian woman, apparently fleeing eastward from Coronado's command on the Pecos River, fell into the clutches of Moscoso's soldiers. Moscoso, however, did not believe her story of contact with other Spaniards and continued his efforts to find his own way back to Mexico. Moscoso made the first documented contact by Spaniards with the Indians of the Hasinai Confederacy in East Texas. The next recorded contact by Europeans with the Texas coast was in 1554, and it was unintentional and dramatic. It was the result of 3 Spanish ships being wrecked off Padre Island in a storm. The more than 200 survivors included some women and children. Most of them were killed by Indians as they tried to make their way back to Mexico, but some escaped by boat and on foot. Early Spanish explorers in Texas and surrounding areas acquired little of value other than knowledge, but their trips had major significance for the natives who fell prey to European diseases, including smallpox and measles. Pathogens spread not only from Europeans to Indians, but also from tribe to tribe, with some groups eventually approaching extinction. This woman, Maria de Jesus de Agreda, was a Spanish nun who had a huge impact on the spread of Catholicism in Texas. This nun, who never left Spain during her life, was reported to lapse into deep trances, during which her spirit was transported to distant lands, where she taught Christian doctrine to pagans, including the Humanos of Texas. Between 1629 and 1654, expeditions from New Mexico entered Texas to search for these Indians, some of whom did display rudimentary knowledge of Catholicism and claimed association with a woman in blue, the color of Sister Meridia's cloak. After church officials investigated these claims, the nun was credited with the conversion of thousands of Indians and gained legendary status as the Lady in Blue. When the successful Pueblo Revolt of 1680 forced the prolonged abandonment of New Mexico, El Paso del Norte, where settlement west of the Rio Grande had occurred as early as the mid-1650s, became the focal point of the Spanish presence on the extreme northern frontier. Its sparse population was severely tested by the arrival of nearly 2,000 Spanish and Indian refugees from New Mexico. To accommodate the Indian exiles, the Spaniards founded the first mission in Pueblo within the present boundaries of Texas, Corpus Christi de la Isleta, at the modern site of Isleta. In the following years, efforts also were made to found missions among the seemingly receptive Jumano Indians at the junction of the Conchos and Rio Grande near the site of present-day Presidio. In 1682, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, explored the Mississippi to its mouth and formally named the region Louisiana to honor his king, Louis XIV, thereby claiming the region that De Soto had explored for Spain in the 1500s. La Salle returned to France in 1683 to begin to lay colonization plans before the court at Versailles. The resultant expedition sailed from France in 1684, but overshot the Mississippi by some 400 miles to land at Matagorda Bay in Texas early in 1685. By the time La Salle discovered that he had not landed at his river, the Mississippi, he was stranded on the Texas coast and had become the object of a resolute Spanish manhunt. The Spanish dispatched 5 sea and 6 land expeditions, 4 of them in Texas, in search of La Salle's settlement. In 1689, Alonso de Leon finally discovered its ruins on Garcitas Creek, as well as 3 bodies, including that of a woman with an arrow in her back. By then, La Salle, a victim of assassination at the hands of other Frenchmen, had been dead for 2 years. The vast majority of the roughly 180 men, women, and children who had accompanied him fared little better. Madame Barbier, who gave birth to the first documented European child born in Texas, was killed by warriors, Indian warriors, during the Karankawa's final assault on the outpost, and her baby was bashed against a tree trunk. Only 16 colonists survived. Some were children saved by Karankawa women and taken to live among these Indians as if they were their own. Father Damien Massenet, who had accompanied the expedition of 1689 to Texas, volunteered his services and those of his brethren of the College of Santa Cruz de Querétaro should missions be authorized among the sedentary Hasinai Indians, who were among the most populous, impressive Indians in all of Texas. In May 1690, Father Massenet founded San Francisco de los Tejas, the first mission within the confines of present-day Texas, located about 5 miles west of Mission Tejas State Historical Park in Houston County. The sophisticated, agricultural, Caddo-speaking Hasinai, at whom the enterprise was directed, indicated willingness to cooperate because the ubiquitous nun, Maria de Jesus de Agreda, had supposedly visited them long ago. Subject to attack from better armed Apaches and Osages, these Caddos hoped that the Spaniards would offer protection and provide firearms, as the French were doing for their enemies. For the Spanish neophytes, the results proved disappointing in all respects, because under Spanish rules, they could only give items of civilization rather than guns or tools of war. Father Massenet alleged that Spanish-Indian relations also suffered as the result of acts of sexual violence against Native women committed by soldiers in both Leon's 1690 expedition and a second incursion led by Domingo Terán de los Rios in 1691. Adding to the alienation of the Hasinai was that close contact with Spaniards left them susceptible to deadly diseases, beginning with a smallpox epidemic in 1691 that claimed hundreds of lives. The missionaries' position became increasingly precarious because Massenet disregarded Alonso de Leon's recommendation that a contingent of 50 soldiers be stationed at San Francisco. Instead, the cleric had insisted that only 3 remain, the same as the number of missionaries. Believing that a rebellion was imminent, the friars made the decision to abandon the mission in October 1693. Burying the cannon and the bell, they set the structure ablaze and retreated to Coahuila. One of the missionaries, Father Francisco Hidalgo, promised the Caddos that he would return to minister to their spiritual needs, and fulfilling that promise became his consuming passion. In 1716, Father Isidro Felix de Espinosa, Father Francisco Hidalgo, and Father Antonio Margil de Jesus re-established Mission San Francisco at a different site from the original and renamed it San Francisco de los Neches de los Tejas. They also founded 5 new missions: Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción de Acuña, Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe de los Nacogdoches, San José de los Nazones, Nuestra Señora de los Dolores de los Ais, and San Miguel de los Linares de los Adais, near the site of present Robeline, Louisiana. At the western edge of the mission field, Ramon built Nuestra Señora de los Dolores de los Tejas Presidio. The re-establishment of missions in the Presidio in East Texas was very important historically. It gave Spain a valid claim to the land north of the Rio Grande. It did much to determine that Texas would be Spanish, not French, and helped to advance the eventual boundary between Texas and Louisiana to the Sabine River. Although the Spanish again received a friendly welcome from the first peoples of East Texas, the latter proved unwilling to congregate in missions. For these sedentary agricultural Caddos, it made little sense for them to give up their homes, ample supplies of food, and way of life for residence in a Spanish mission, with its enforced discipline and alien Christian message. Also, mutually beneficial trading networks existed between the French and the Caddos, as well as important kinship ties forged by marriages between Frenchmen and Indian women. The French traders provided Indians with guns, bullets, powder, knives, and such, in return for horses, hides, and captives, while the missionaries just offered sermons. The arrival in Mexico City in 1716 of a new viceroy, the Marqués de Valero, proved critical for the struggling missions and Presidio in East Texas. At the instigation of Father Antonio de San Buenaventura y Olivares, who had earlier visited a site on the San Antonio River in 1709 and determined to establish a mission and civilian settlement there, the viceroy pledged critically needed support for the Franciscan missions in Texas. Late in 1716, Valero gave formal approval for a halfway mission and Presidio, with responsibility for their establishment assigned to Martín de Alarcón, the governor of Coahuila in Texas. On May 1, 1718, the governor founded San Antonio de Valero Mission, later famous as the Alamo, on the San Antonio River, and San Antonio de Béjar Presidio was established 4 days later. The governor also created Béjar, the only villa chartered town in Texas. In 1719, a brief war in Europe between Spain and France overflowed into Texas. From Natchitoches, Philippe Blondel and 6 soldiers easily captured the poorly defended Adayes mission. In the resulting confusion, a lay brother escaped and spread fear of an impending French attack throughout the mission outposts all the way to Presidio de Lourdes. There, Captain Ramon viewed the situation as untenable, since his men were without arms or horses. He ordered immediate abandonment of the 6 missions and the military garrison. The retreating Spaniards found refuge at the new settlements on the San Antonio River, where Father Margil began building a second mission, San Jose y San Miguel de Aguayo, which is pictured here. The Marqués de San Miguel de Aguayo, the governor of Coahuila in Texas, entered Texas in the spring of 1721 with the most imposing force Spain would ever send into Texas. He had recruited 500 men and collected 2,800 horses, 4,800 cattle, and 6,400 sheep and goats. Spanish ranching in Texas began with the arrival of these large herds in 1721. Aguayo accomplished the reestablishment of the abandoned missions in East Texas and founded a new presidio, Nuestra Señora del Pilar at Los Arayas, and secured a lasting peace with the French settlement at Natchitoches. The Spanish government in 1721 named the easternmost mission presidio complex at Los Arayas the capital of the Texas province. When the Marqués de Aguayo departed Texas in May 1722, he left a province that was soon separated from Coahuila. It was secured by more than 250 soldiers at 4 presidios, 10 missions, and hundreds of potential neophytes, in addition to the core of the small civilian settlement at San Antonio. The threat of French dominance in Texas was ended. Among Aguayo's other noteworthy actions in Texas was to have Domingo Ramon in 1722 begin construction of Nuestra Señora del Espíritu Santo de Zúñiga Mission and Nuestra Señora de Loreto Presidio, both commonly called La Bahia, at the site of La Salle's earlier failed settlement. For the San Antonio area, the nobleman selected a new site for the Béjar Presidio and founded a short-lived mission south of the mission Valero. The Spanish viceroy in Mexico City sent Brigadier General Pedro de Rivera y Villalón to make a thorough inspection of frontier posts in Texas. Rivera's subsequent cost-saving recommendations in 1727 led to the reduction of troop strength at Los Arayas and to the abandonment of Presidio de Lourdes. Left without adequate military support, the missions of San Francisco, Concepcion, and San Jose were moved westward to the Colorado River and subsequently to San Antonio in 1731. Unfortunately for the residents of San Antonio, the reduction of military strength in Texas left the settlement vulnerable to Indian raids. By the mid-1720s, 44 families resided at the Béjar Presidio, almost all of which included soldiers. Jesus de la Teja, a historian, said from its founding in 1718 to 1731, 47 couples married and 107 children were baptized at Mission Valero. On March 9, 1731, 55 Canary Islanders, comprising 15 families, 2 of which were headed by widows, arrived in San Antonio. One reality Béjar residents, old and new, had to face was the threat posed by Indians, particularly the Lipan Apaches, who found the San Antonio settlement a tempting target and initiated raids there in the 1720s. Although the peril abated from time to time, the severity of the attacks worsened notably in the 1750s with the appearance of the Comanches at San Antonio. Relative latecomers to Texas from the north, the more mobile Comanches effectively incorporated Spanish horses and weaponry to counter Spanish colonialism, and created their own imperial organization that dominated the Southwest for over a century. The Comanches attacked their Indian rivals, most notably the semi-sedentary Lipans, who in turn put pressure on San Antonio. As one presidial officer reported, the inhabitants of Béjar lived in almost constant terror. In the summer of 1768, Béjareños had to fight off a 22-day siege without outside assistance. The Viceroy of New Spain approved the appointment of masterful organizer José de Escandón as military commander and governor over the recently established province of Nuevo Santander, which came to include part of Texas below the Nueces River. Between 1748 and 1755, the colonizer founded 24 towns, 2 of which were within present-day Texas, along with 15 missions. Escandón also moved the mission Presidio at La Bahia from their second location on the Guadalupe River to the site of the present-day Goliad on the San Antonio River. The founding of Laredo completed colonization efforts that had relocated more than 6,000 Spaniards, congregated nearly 3,000 Indians, and helped establish the cattle industry in the lower Rio Grande Valley. In the area of modern Rockdale, Texas, 3 Franciscan missions and a presidio were founded in the late 1740s and early 1750s to minister to the Tonkawa Indians and allied groups. These Indians had indicated a willingness to be missionized, but their major motivation was to seek protection from Lipan raiders. Internal discord, fatal diseases, serious drought, occasional flooding, and Apache raids all played a role in the eventual failure of this undertaking. Also instrumental was conflict between licentious Presidial Commander Felipe de Rabago y Terán, whose immoral conduct was emulated by his men, and the resident missionaries that led to the temporary excommunication of the military contingent. Then, in 1752, a controversial double murder took the life of the husband of one of Rabago's conquests, as well as that of a missionary. The officer attempted to blame former Indian neophytes. However, circumstantial evidence and damning testimony cast suspicion on the commander and some of his men. He and 5 others were sent to Coahuila and there placed under house arrest. In 1757, the entire assets of the San Javier missions were redirected to a new religious outpost for the Apaches in central Texas, and this would be the most disastrous mission extension project in the history of Spanish Texas. A new mission presidio complex was established in the late 1750s at the request of Lipan Apaches, known for their previous hostility to the Spanish. Under increasing pressure from the mobile, well-armed Comanches, Wichitas, and others, the Lipans adopted a new coping strategy designed to draw the Spaniards into their enemy's orbit. The Apaches not only pretended an interest in becoming neophytes, but also assured the Spaniards that silver could be found to the north, 2 powerful motivators for Spaniards. Following a peace treaty negotiated at San Antonio in 1749, authorities in Mexico City ordered the selection of a mission site in Apacharilla. In so doing, the Spaniards gained a powerful new enemy in the Comanches. In 1757, near present-day Menard, Texas, Colonel Diego Ortiz Padilla and Franciscan missionaries, headed by Father Alonso Giraldo de Terreros, established San Luis de las Amarillas Presidio and San Cruz de San Saba Mission, which was across the river about 3 miles from the stockade. During its brief existence of less than a year, the mission did not attract a single Apache resident. What it did attract was the enmity of the Lipan's Indian adversaries, the Comanches. When perpetrating raids on other Indians, the Apaches deliberately left behind Spanish items to demonstrate their ties to San Saba, hoping to draw their enemies into conflict with each other. The plan worked all too well, as the Comanches came to view the new mission as a refuge from which the Apaches could attack them. In mid-March 1758, perhaps as many as 2,000 Comanches and their allies, including Wichitas, Bedai, Hasinai, and Tonkawas, converged on the mission that they pillaged and burned. Bearing French arms, bullet pouches, and very large powder horns, the attackers killed 8 persons, including Father Terreros, who was shot, and another friar who was decapitated. 1 cleric and perhaps 24 others managed to escape, as Santa Cruz de San Saba became the only mission in Texas to be destroyed by an outright Indian attack. It was never rebuilt. The question of how to respond to the assault on San Saba received serious consideration in Mexico City. Ultimately, the conclusion was that the Indians had to be taught that even in their most remote haunts, they would not be secure from the long arm of Spanish vengeance. While plans for the punitive expedition were in progress, the emboldened Comanches in March 1779 ambushed 21 soldiers guarding the livestock of the San Saba Presidio, killed all but 1 of the Spaniards, and made away with 700 horses, cattle, and mules. In September 1759, almost 18 months after the destruction of the mission, Diego Ortiz Padilla began the march in pursuit of the enemy. With him were hundreds of presidial soldiers, untrained volunteers, and Indian allies, including Lipan Apaches. Unfortunately for the Spaniards, the lengthy preparations allowed time for the Comanches to learn of the threat, so they moved to the Red River to prepare their defenses. Upon finally locating the Comanches' encampment, Ortiz Padilla was distressed to find his group outnumbered by the Wichitas, Comanches, and others on the north bank of the river in a well-fortified Tauvaya town flying a French flag. Many were also armed with French muskets. In the resultant clash of arms that lasted for hours, neither side could claim victory. The following day, Ortiz Padilla, whose dead, wounded, and missing totaled more than 50, ordered a retreat and left 2 field pieces behind. Determined to make his empire more defensible, profitable, and efficient, the Spanish king, Charles III, instigated what came to be known as the Bourbon Reforms, based on experimentation, innovation, and rationality. Needing accurate information on which to base his decisions, the king commissioned inspectors to tour his overseas possessions and report back to him. The Marquess de Rubi received instructions from the crown to conduct a reconnaissance of all presidios along the Spanish borderlands. Rubi arrived in Spanish Texas in 1767 and was less than impressed by what he observed. After visiting all major settlements in the province, the Marquess concluded that they could not be maintained without needed consolidation and new resources. The inspector recommended moving both the civilian population and remaining missions from East Texas to San Antonio. Rubi proposed a new approach aimed at developing friendly relations with the powerful Comanches and Wichitas, coupled with a war of extermination against their enemies, the Apaches, whom he deemed responsible for numerous depredations. In 1772, a royal order issued that called for abandoning all missions and presidios in Texas, except at La Bahia and San Antonio, designating San Antonio as the capital of the province, relocating the East Texas soldiers and settlers to the new capital, and inaugurating the new Indian policy aimed at exterminating the Apaches. In the summer of 1773, Baron Juan Maria de Ripperda, the governor of Texas, reluctantly ordered the closure of missions in East Texas and forcible removal of the entire Spanish population to San Antonio. The roughly 500 settlers who were being displaced were reluctant to leave their homes and livelihood, and they suffered severely during the three-month march that claimed many lives. For the most part, the survivors found San Antonio not to their liking and petitioned to be allowed to return to their homes. Under the leadership of Antonio Gil Ibarvo, they finally received permission to resettle East Texas, but could go no farther than the Trinity River, which was a considerable distance from Natchitoches, Louisiana. Still, the refugees viewed any concession as encouraging. In late summer 1774, they founded the settlement of Bucareli at a site in present Madison County. The town attracted 347 residents by 1777, but was plagued by troublesome floods and Comanche raids. Without authorization, in 1779 the inhabitants moved again, this time to the location of the old mission of Nacogdoches, where they founded a new town with that name. Nacogdoches, along with La Bahia, San Antonio, and Laredo, became another permanent settlement within the boundaries of present-day Texas. Troubles with the Comanches continued until 1785, when Governor Domingo Cabello y Robles distributed gifts to the Comanches while offering them a choice between friendship or war. They were advised that alliances with the Spaniards would make them friends to Spain's other Indian allies, except the Lipans and Apaches, with whom I do not want anyone to be friends, but to make continual war against them. Several Comanche leaders met with Cabello in San Antonio and signed a treaty, whereby hostilities would end not just in the province, but beyond. Annual presents would be bestowed upon the chiefs, and these bands would have safe passage through the province to make war on Apaches. The treaty finally brought peace that lasted, with some interruptions, for 35 years. The following population figures were compiled between January and December 1804. Nacogdoches, 789. Presidio Company of San Antonio de Bejar, 413. Mission San Juan Capistrano, 74. Mission San Antonio de Valero, 121. Presidio or Settlement of La Bahia, 399. Presidio Company of La Bahia, 301. Missions La Bahia, Rosario, and Refugio, 224. Mission San Francisco de la Espada, 107. Villa San Fernando de Bejar and Presidio of Bejar, 1,117. Notice that the last one I mentioned, the Villa San Fernando de Bejar and Presidio of Bejar, is the settlement that comprises modern-day San Antonio. And it was the only settlement in Texas that had over 1,000 people. Nacogdoches was in second place with 789 people. So the Spanish settlements in Texas in the early 1800s were very, very small. The total number of Spaniards in Texas, according to this count in 1804, was 3,605. Although this Spanish-speaking population included merchants and a few artisans such as tailors and blacksmiths, most of these Spanish Texans or Tejanos were stock raisers and small farmers. By 1799, 24 females headed families on the East Texas frontier. As old as 85 and as young as 34, these diverse widows included Hispanics, castas, meaning women of mixed race, Indians, French, and one called American. At Bejar, 20 years earlier, 3 women whose names we do know, Maria Ana Corbello, Leonor Delgado, and Maria del Carmen Calvillo, were among the top 10 cattle owners in the area. The first 2 were widowed, while the third had an absentee husband. Each proved more than capable of caring for her family, its land, and other possessions, especially Calvillo, who, upon the death of her father in 1814, assumed ownership and management of Rancho de las Cabras. The Hispanic population of Texas in 1810, when Father Miguel Hidalgo issued his historic Grito de Dolores, was probably fewer than 5,000. Juan Bautista de las Casas and a few fellow conspirators led an insurrection in San Antonio that was initially successful. By the summer of 1811, however, men loyal to the crown suppressed the Casas revolt and restored royal authority. José Bernardo Maximiliano Gutierrez de Lara, a Mexican rebel, and Augustus W. McGee, a former United States Army officer, organized something called the Republican Army of the North, a disparate band of filibusterers who captured Nacogdoches, La Bahia, and San Antonio. After the death of McGee and the fall of the capital in 1813, Gutierrez issued a Declaration of Independence of the state of Texas and drafted a centralist or conservative constitution. The rebels were torn by dissension, caused in part by Gutierrez's tendency toward dictatorial behavior and the brutal execution of prisoners, including the governor. The insurgents suffered a disastrous defeat at the hands of Joaquin de Arredondo at the Battle of Medina on August 18, 1813. Perhaps as many as 1,300 Republican Army soldiers, 13 of every 14, died during this battle or were shot afterwards. Subsequently, Arredondo's bloody purges of suspected collaborations among the civilian population gave him the nickname of the Butcher of Bejar and left an indelible mark on Texas. But in the process, he did ensure that Texas would remain under Spain's control until Mexican independence was achieved in 1821.